I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, someone who's never afraid to ask the tough questions, and even more so not afraid to offer some tough answers. Oren Cass. In his 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, Oren challenges our basic assumptions about what prosperity means. The book has spurred a national conversation about how conservatives and libertarians think about free markets and how we can improve free enterprise and do a better job of creating opportunity for everyone. Oren Cass is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where his work on strengthening the labor market addresses issues ranging from social safety net and environmental regulation to trade and organized labor. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and he often speaks at college campuses around the country and testifies at congressional hearings in Washington. Again, after his remarks, please form a line to ask questions at the mics. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Oren Cass.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you guys all for being here. I have spoken to many of your chapters over the last few years. I really love what you are building on campus. The reason I get to speak today is I just handed in my 12-chapter punch card to Greg, and he had no choice but to let me onto the stage. But the topic that I want to talk about today actually fits incredibly well with Jim's, and it's a little unfair that I now get to go second and tell you everything I disagree with about Jim, but he can have the first question if he wants, I suppose. And I guess the other thing I should mention, I'll be talking about my book. It's in your bag. More importantly, there's a really cool pair of socks in your bag, so pick up the bag for that, but then also take a look at the book. What I really want to talk about today is pie, and a concept that I think was actually implicit in a lot of what Jim was just talking about, and which really pervades our policy and political conversations, which is the idea of the economic pie. The idea that we can talk about our economy in the aggregate as a pie, that our goal should be to grow the pie, and then maybe we can fight a little bit about how to divide it. But really, generally speaking, so almost every president since Harry Truman, Democrat and Republican, has spoken about the economic pie. New York Times, Wall Street Journal both editorialized about the economic pie. At least until Donald Trump, our politics was really about what is the best way to grow the pie, and then how much slicing up should we do. And so I think it's important to actually think a little bit more deeply about the implications about this. So this is from the New York Times. It's a really interesting chart they made of every county in the country by share of personal income that comes from transfer payments. And this is 1974. It's sort of a nice pastel map for the most part. 10 to 20% of income in a county comes from transfer payments, and GDP was about $6.5 trillion. Now, if you grow and redistribute the pie enough, you get 2014. We tripled our GDP, and to ensure that everybody won, we did an enormous amount of transferring from winners to losers. So you now see county by county transfers up in the 30-40% range outside of a few cities. And you see even those splotches up above 50% in some places. And so the first question I would ask is just, is this the most serious problem that we face as a country, or is this the ultimate sign of our success? If you actually believe the economic pie model, that the focus should be on growing the pie, and to the extent that we're concerned about everybody's well-being, we can redistribute, you would have to define this as success. This is, in fact, exactly what we said we were going for, and on its own terms, it has worked. In even the darkest purple corners of the country, material standards of living are higher than they've ever been. So if you want to ask how much people are getting to consume, everyone at every level in our society, right down to the bottom, is doing better than ever. That's, I think, pretty undeniably true. And yet there's something, as we look at that says, no, maybe we said that's what we're going for, but that can't possibly be what we meant. And we can't possibly be satisfied with that result. So what did we miss? What's not baked into the pie, as it were? I'll go ahead and just directly quote Adam Smith, because that's what you're supposed to do at an Adam Smith Society meeting. Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interests of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. The maxim is so perfectly self-evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it." Now, first of all, when you have to write, "This is so self-evident I don't have to prove it," you're probably not on the right track. But I think it's actually more interesting to go back to something Jim said, and this is where I'll pick on him a little bit. He did two things that were actually quite different. One, I was delighted. He defined happiness as serving others. And then two, he showed us that everybody's standard of everybody is wildly better off than ever before because per capita income is higher than ever, because no one is living on less than $1 to $3 a day, a measure of consumption. But if happiness is serving others, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit to say that happiness is being a productive contributor to society, happiness is fulfilling your obligations, playing a role in your community, supporting your family, then actually whether your consumption is at level A or level B doesn't tell you enough. We actually need to be awfully concerned that going on 20% of prime age males aren't in the workforce. That in the more depressed areas of the country, it's up above 30, going on 40%. And that those folks aren't doing better, no matter how high their consumption is. And so the focus of my book is on what I call the working hypothesis, which is the idea that a labor market in which workers can support strong families and communities is the central determinant of long-term prosperity and should be the central focus of public policy. Now, I wanted to call the book The Working Hypothesis. I thought it had kind of a cool, edgy Jason Bourne thriller kind of feel. The publisher said it had like a boring, wonky book you didn't want to read kind of feel. But it is the name of the introduction, because you get to name your own introduction. And what I'll talk about is why I think this is true. First of all, how is it different? I think it's important to emphasize that this is a different way of talking about what we want and what we should be going for than is traditional. Second of all, why is it true? And then third of all, what would it imply? So how is this different? The obsession with the economic pie I'll call economic piety, and we'll match it up against the working hypothesis. So one difference is the question of just what we're optimizing for. If you're asking whether a policy is a good one or not, is the question, what's its effect on GDP growth? That's generally the measure we use from an economic piety perspective. Or I would argue, is it good for self-sufficiency? Is it actually going to improve people's capacity up and down the income ladder to actually support themselves and their family? A corollary of that is we're going to think very differently about winners and losers. So from the economic piety perspective, we're just going to ensure that gains to the winners exceed losses to the losers. One thing I appreciate about Jim's talk is that he was quite upfront that we're not necessarily actually going to do the redistribution, right? We're going to say it's a good policy because you could make everybody whole. We're not necessarily going to do it. The working hypothesis would more set a floor below the losses, even at some cost to total efficiency. And I think there's actually an economic intuition for this, which is that the marginal value of gains changes. You know, one problem with the Bill Gates example is that $90 billion is great, but so is $900 million, and it's not clear what the actual value, even to Bill Gates, associated from going from $900 million to $90 billion is. If we take a whole bunch of people who are doing very well and double their income, and on the other side we take a whole bunch of people at $30,000 a year and drop them to $20,000 a year, we can defend that as being incredibly efficient, prosperity enhancing, GDP per capita enhancing. And at the same time, if we're actually trying to measure utility and prosperity society-wide, we can have done a tremendous amount of damage. And then third, and this goes directly to the point that Jim made about the correlation between wealth and all of those other things we want, you know, the correlation versus causation question I think is actually extremely important. The economic piety model assumes that if we get the economic growth, we're going to get all those other things that we actually really care about an awful lot more. The working hypothesis flips that and says actually those other things we care about, the stable society, the healthy families, all those other measures of things that humans really value, those are actually sort of the prerequisite to the growth, that growth is an emergent property of a society that has those things. And as Jim said, it's certainly an open question debated in all corners which of those stories is right, but it's also true that to say these things are very, very closely correlated does not strengthen the argument for causation. They can be very, very closely correlated precisely because the causation runs the other way. And so to make this concrete, I want to offer everybody a hypothetical that I call the 20% button. Here's the 20% button. It's a button you get to push, and the most productive quintile of the labor force instantly becomes twice as productive. And the least productive quintile instantly drops out of the labor force. And if you want to stipulate, by pushing the button, you can also implement a tax policy that redistributes so that the least productive quintile is better off as well. Or if you prefer, you can say they're entitled to nothing, they're unlucky. So do you push the button? And it's a serious question, you all have to answer it. We'll start with who here in the audience does push the button? Okay, who does not push the button? Okay, and who didn't raise their hand because they really want to fight the hypothetical? Thank you for acknowledging that. Right, so I posed this on Twitter recently, which is of course a very scientific sample. It actually is a very scientific sample of people who like to fight about these kinds of things. And of 40 responses, 20 said no, 3 said yes, and 17 fought the hypothetical. Which I think is a reflection that we're roughly split 50-50 on how we feel about this, but only half of us are willing to say so. And that's a really interesting sort of story for how we think about this, because it's really important to emphasize that certainly the standard libertarian model, and because libertarian economic theory has counted as conservative economic theory, the standard right of center argument has been to push the button. And just as importantly, the democratic argument, the left of center argument would be to push the button. We're going to do an awful lot of that redistribution on the back end. But the entire model that we have pursued has been to say that, yes, this is actually a perfectly healthy way to proceed. And yet, when we actually think about it, that might not be such a good idea. So why might this be true? What is it intuitively, what is it economically that suggests there's something going on here? Well, I think there are two things. One is this importance of work. I think it's incredibly important to recognize that people's roles as workers, as producers in society, really is more important than consumption. Now, certainly there's that base level of absolute poverty that you want to be above. But once you move up even into relatively low levels of income, you find that actually working matters a lot more. It's closely correlated to people's self-esteem, their mental health. It's closely tied to their life satisfaction and self-reported happiness. And I should say, I think most happiness studies are garbage. But the good ones look at the same people over a long period of time, because then you have a control. And when you ask people over long periods of time how they're feeling about their life, you find two very interesting things. One is we all kind of just have our base level, whether it's genetic, environmental. Some of you are a 9, some of you are a 7, and that's just the way it's going to be. And it turns out that almost anything that happens to you causes a blip on that: marriage, divorce, birth of a child, death of a relative, even a long-term disability. Those create blips, but we adapt incredibly quickly, and you go right back to being a 9 or a 7. So that's interesting. The second thing that's interesting is that the only exception to all of that in the literature is long-term unemployment. People who go from working to not working move to a permanently lower level of happiness that they never recover from. And finally, work is incredibly important to economic opportunity. You can't move up the economic ladder unless you are on the economic ladder. And we can maintain people at any given level of well-being with transfers, but they're going to need that exact same transfer the next year, most of the time. Now, I would say at least importantly, work is incredibly important to family and to community, to the institutions of our society that are, I think, ultimately the fount of a lot of what we want, including sustainably replicating our prosperity from generation to generation. So for the family, we know that work is incredibly important, especially for men, to family formation, to getting married in the first place. It's incredibly important to family stability. Male unemployment is an extremely strong predictor of divorce. And it's incredibly important for outcomes for children. Children tend to have better outcomes later in life in families where they have a parent who's working. And they even have better outcomes in life just in a community where more of the adults are working. And then for that community, we know that higher levels of employment in a community are correlated with lower levels of crime and addiction, higher levels of social capital, on almost any measure you can think of. And really importantly, and this is a concrete economic rationale, every community needs to be able to make something that the rest of the world wants. Okay? Our attachment to manufacturing is not this weird, nostalgic, archaic thing. If you don't make something in your local economy, and admittedly there are services that are tradable too, but generally it's manufactured goods. If your local market doesn't make something that the rest of the world wants, how are you going to participate in that cooperative exchange to get everything you want from the rest of the world? right? We can be a services-based economy. We can be 80% services, but we can't all serve each other coffee. If you don't have something the rest of the world wants in return for the cars and medicine and electricity and everything you want from the rest of the world, you end up doing what we call exporting need. Actually, I should say what I call. No one else hasn't caught on yet, but it will. You do what I call exporting need, okay? Which is that the transfer payments, those dark red shades on the map, that's how you get your resources from the rest of the world, okay? Food stamps actually becomes the way that you get what your community needs. And you see that if you drive through a depressed region of the country, you'll see the stereotypical dilapidated shopping plaza, and you'll see a really shiny occupational therapy office right in the middle of it. And you wonder, what the hell is that doing there? That is literally the community's exporter. They are exporting to taxpayers care of the people in that community who are on disability. And once you're in that spiral, it's incredibly difficult to get out of. And you become increasingly dependent on that model, which again, you can sustain people at a level of consumption that way, but you're not going to make progress. You're not going to share in the prosperity that the economy is generating. And then finally, work just turns out to be incredibly important to our economic progress itself, okay? Certain kinds of work, industries, particularly high technology, manufacturing, the places where we actually get our productivity gains are things a country has to be involved in if you want to be generating higher levels of prosperity over time. And even if you want to attract the kinds of businesses that are going to build that prosperity. I mean, this is a very large group of business school students. We'll do hand raising again. How many of you have a career plan that calls for you to go into an industry and a job where you're going to be boosting the productivity of and working directly with workers who didn't go to college? Some. Generally, it's, and if you look at the business school graduate data where people end up, it's certainly below 20%. And yet it's probably by far the greatest social challenge that we face and the greatest economic challenge that we face, and the place where we actually need our most talented business leaders to be going for us to deliver the kind of prosperity we want to have. So second reason this is true. It's fine to say work is important, but you might think that's great, the market's going to deliver it. And go back to the Adam Smith view. It was peace, administration of justice, and what was the third thing we need? And easy taxes. With those three things, the rest pretty much works itself out. That is true if what you want is an efficient market outcome, but that's not the right way to think about the labor market, because people aren't products. And I mean that in the moral sense, but I more importantly for this purpose mean it in the economic sense. So first of all, supply is not responsive to market forces. You can have price signals screaming that chemists are worth 10 times what cashiers are for as many decades as you want, and families cannot shift their production line from cashier to chemist. The people who we have in our society who are going to be the workers essentially are the people they are, regardless of what the market might value work most. And then secondly, we can't simply accept the efficient outcome as the most socially valuable one. If the market signal says your business's product stinks, we actually kind of like it that you go out of business. If you have to write off your inventory, if we have to drill more or less for oil because prices are higher or lower, that's exactly what we want the market to deliver. If the signal the market sends is that an awful lot of Americans just kind of don't have anything they can do that's going to be valuable enough to support a family, the efficient response might be to say, that's all right, then they're not in the labor market. Their labor isn't demanded. But for social purposes, for what we actually want out of our society, we might say that's just not an acceptable outcome. That we have different desires for the outcome of the labor market besides simply its efficiency. And if that's the case, then there's no reason to expect, there's nothing from Adam Smith, there's nothing in Economics 101 that says that where the market is going to land is going to be where society wants it to. So what does this imply? If this is a different way of thinking about things, if it's actually true, well, first of all, it implies some things that we should talk about a lot less. The standard view of the respectable centrist who's going to supposedly save the country essentially comes down to I'm for globalization and a strong social safety net. It's kind of the new age, I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal. But as we've seen, redistribution isn't going to be sufficient. Simply growing the economy as fast as we can and having a stronger safety net isn't going to get us where we need to go. The second thing that's very popular to say, if you want to make no actual changes to the actual way that we do things economically, is, well, people can move. There are plenty of parts of the country where people are doing well, and if everybody moves there, we'll be fine. There's actually an economic study showing how much higher GDP would be if everyone in the country lived in San Francisco, which, I don't know, apparently that's economics. But relocation is not going to happen, and it's important to emphasize that it never has happened. That as much as moving is part of the American dream, staying where you are is also part of the American dream, and that is the American dream for most people. So this is the population of Iowa every decade as it went through the mechanization of agriculture. It grew every single decade from 1880 to 1980, even as demand for farm labor obviously plummeted. This is Maine going straight through deindustrialization. More people living in Maine today than ever before, despite its economic challenges. And this is Oklahoma. Of course, the Dust Bowl, 1930s, Okies moving to California is the quintessential story of Americans moving to opportunity, except that the population of Oklahoma declined less than 3% that decade. Farmers were least likely to move, and actually out-migration rates didn't go up much at all. Fewer people moved to Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl 1930s. I suppose that's interesting. But it's not a story of labor mobility as a solution to our economic challenges. And so it remains the case today, most Americans live with, adult Americans live within 18 miles of their mother. 37%, and a much higher share of those without a college degree, have never lived outside their hometown. And it actually even turns out that we're not doing a great job providing an attractive opportunity to move anymore. We see particularly the lack of movement to the supposedly more prosperous cities. And yes, if you have a good degree, a city is a very prosperous place to be. But David Otter's work now shows that if you don't have a college degree, a prosperous city is no longer a more attractive place to be. So this is looking at, across decades, earnings for, in gray, college grads, in orange, high school grads, as they live in increasingly dense places. And in the 50s, you see exactly what you would think. Denser cities, higher wages. The high school curve is just below the college curve. That was true at a much higher level in the 1980s. That's back when we were generating the kind of widespread prosperity we expected our market system to deliver. It doesn't look so true anymore in 2000. The orange line stopped moving up and started flattening. And when you get to 2015, the orange line has flattened completely and has flattened down. So it's certainly a lot more expensive to live in a city, but if you don't have a college degree, you're actually not even going to get paid more necessarily to live there. We can't turn around and say, well, then why aren't people moving to cities? Because it would be a really silly thing to do in a lot of cases. Finally, education. Are we going to educate our way out of these problems? No, we're not. Not everyone can be a knowledge worker. In fact, not most people can be knowledge workers. If you take a group of 100 students entering the 9th grade in this country, about 18 still won't graduate from high school on time. Another 25 won't even go to college. Of those who do, about half won't complete even within 150% of the expected time. And lest you believe that what our labor market is really saying is we need more college grads, about 40% of new college grads end up in jobs that don't even require a degree. So we've got less than 1 in 5 moving high school to college to career, the path that's supposedly going to save us. And even more distressingly, we're not doing better over time. So we have doubled per pupil spending in K through 12 over the last 40 years. But here's how we've done on test scores. Reading scores, math scores, essentially no statistically significant increase over the entire 40-year period. SAT scores actually down a little bit. Now that's partly because more people are taking the SAT, but we're certainly not generating a larger and more college-ready group. And frankly, we're not even doing that well at the high school level. We're up about 2 points in high school graduation rate. And maybe most depressingly, this is bachelor's degree attainment by age 25 from the Brookings Institution. So this is based on birth. So people born in the 50s going to college in the 70s, about 30% of them attained a bachelor's degree by age 25. It went up and down a little bit, but you can get to people born in 1990 coming out of college at the beginning of this decade, and it's maybe 2 or 3 points higher. So let's keep gaining, even if we could keep this going and gain another 2 or 3 points every generation, we'd be up to 40% at the end of the century. So whatever our solution is going to have to be one that provides actual economic opportunity for people who do not have college degrees, who are not going to move to a city and who cannot simply be written a check to go away. The last part of this is implications for public policy. I think that's the most interesting and important part. If you believe all this is true, what do we actually do about it? Because one thing you'd say, and I think this is an important and correct point that libertarians make, is just because something's a problem doesn't mean government's going to solve it. And I certainly don't think a big government program is going to solve any of this. But I think there's an awful lot that we did in the basic choices we made about how we organized our society in pursuit of just growing and redistributing the pie that have actually led us to where we are, and that we can make different choices on those dimensions. So I'll mention them briefly now, happy to discuss them more in Q&A, and then of course that's what's really going to get you to go home and read the book. So one thing we could do is rethink our trade-off between the economy and the environment. We regulate environmentally right now for the interests of somebody earning $200,000 a year in a coastal city, not for the interests of somebody earning $35,000 a year whose productivity actually depends very much on the health of the industrial economy. We could shift that and say, actually, we're going to target an environmental quality level that makes sense for those who are struggling. We can reorient our education system. Instead of it being college for all, we can actually say, if you're going to college, that's great, but either you belong there, in which case you're one of the winners in this picture, and you can go ahead and pay back a bunch of debt for the rest of your life, or you don't belong there, in which case we should really be offering you something else better. And we can not only build real non-college pathways, but we can take the more than $100 billion a year we spend on the college kids and start moving it over to spend on the non-college kids. Right? Why is it if you're 19 and you're enrolled in college, we've got $10,000 a year of taxpayer money for you? If you're 19 and not enrolled in college, actually trying to find a way into the labor market and start a life, we've got zero for you. That's exactly backward. We can actually rethink some of this trade and immigration stuff. The whole argument for free trade no matter what is it's better in the aggregate. There is no argument anywhere in the economics that free trade no matter what is better for the less skilled workers who get massive new competition with low skilled foreign workers who need fewer wages. They get cheaper stuff, so that's good. But there's no argument that's necessarily better for them as a worker. And so we can be a lot more critical of that. Likewise, having massive amounts of competition from influxes of low-wage immigrants, great if you're a consumer, might be exactly what you want culturally and for the quality of our society, might align with your principles, not good for the low-wage workers who need to support their families who are already here. Organized labor is something we should like, not the 1930s unions that obviously aren't working very well, but some system that lets workers organize, represent each other, negotiate collectively with employers. And then finally, we can reorient the safety net toward making work pay. Instead of making arguments that the safety net is somehow unnecessary, that if we just got rid of it, somehow that would be more just or would produce a better society, we can make it better. We can take a whole lot of the money we just give to people essentially for not working, not for not working, but only if they do not work, and we can instead say, actually, we're going to attach it to work. That if you're in a low-wage job, we're going to put extra money in your paycheck. And that would be far more consistent with what we recognize to be the value of work for the kind of support we want to provide, and therefore ultimately for the kind of prosperity that we're trying to build toward. Thank you very much. All right, I'll take questions until they yell at me to stop.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Jared Shoemaker. I'm from the Cox School of Business at SMU in Dallas. I have two questions actually for you. One is whenever you were presenting the 20% button challenge, what came to my mind was the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. They seem to have made that choice and said yes to pushing the button. They have extremely vigorous free market economies and a huge safety net, the left side. And they also seem to have strong societies, happy people. So I'm just kind of curious how that challenges your perspective. And the second question I have for you is based on your policy proposals. I'm curious what your point of view is on, say, Andrew Yang's proposal of a UBI and what you would say to that.
Yeah, great questions. Never ask two questions, though, because then I can just choose the easier one to answer. I'll attempt both. The easier one to answer is the UBI question, which is that the UBI is ultimately the antithesis of what I'm talking about. The UBI is the ultimate endpoint of the economic piety model that says it really doesn't matter, and we should even celebrate an ever narrower share of people actually driving the productive economy because we can just pay everybody else. In economic terms, it just doesn't work. I mean, this would be a longer conversation, but short of going to roughly a 50% tax rate, you cannot fund what an actual UBI. But I think more importantly, culturally, the implication of a UBI, both in relieving everybody's obligation to actually organize a society that will work for everybody, and in sending a message that says, work and supporting yourself and your family is no longer one of your core obligations as an individual. We hope you work, so you might enjoy it, but supporting your family isn't the point. And ultimately, I think that has an incredible impact on the value of work. When we think about kind of how we define happiness, and at some point this becomes circular, but social norms are circular, welcome to real life. If we think work is valuable and important and a component of a healthy society and a healthy life, it's really important that we honor and respect it and assign value to it. And if we deprive it of that value, it's in a sense just as tangible as cutting the pay associated with it. And so I think it would be a massive mistake. And if someday the robots do everything and we have to figure out what to do, then sure, let's talk about it. But let's certainly not talk about it before actually trying other things. With respect to the Denmark model, I think there are two things to say. One is, the Denmark model is interesting. There are lots of nice things about it if you're up for a 50 to 75% tax rate. And I mean, really, when you get to the employer side taxes, value-added taxes, you're getting up to the 75% range. So yes, you can organize a society that way. It's really important to recognize, though, that empirically, what is happening in Denmark is not a model of a whole bunch of disengaged people sitting at home receiving checks. Now, whether it's because of how they designed their safety net or the culture that is sort of upstream of their design that they could design in the first place because they knew they had the culture, it is a very different arrangement and not one in which you are actually redistributing to people who can't be productive themselves. It is an insurance system that cushions people who, at the end of the day, still jump back into the workforce. So I think we should spend a lot more time taking seriously and studying what does and doesn't work in the Scandinavian systems. But I don't think they are actually an illustration of we can have an ever narrower share of the people actually being the productive contributors building their lives that way.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, Matthew Mon, Boston Professional Chapter. Thanks for coming. We're actually discussing your book in our chapter book club next week. So my question is on the impact of trade deficits to the labor market. In the most recent National Affairs, you argue that a trade deficit that is then used to buy T-bonds is essentially buying goods on credit. Now that seems to me to be an entirely a factor of the government's sort of financial policy. Can you make a similar argument that trade deficits funding private or corporate debt is also negative on the labor market?
Yeah, so this is an important and complicated question. When we're talking about trade as sort of ultimately where the rubber meets the road on a lot of this stuff, I think, it's important to recognize that, at least in my view, very high levels of trade are good and perfectly consistent with all of the things we want. If China were buying $500 billion of stuff a year from us and we were buying $500 billion a year of stuff from China, yes, it would create all sorts of disruptions in our economy as those trade levels went up, but because it would be occurring on both sides, we would be creating new dynamism on our side and creating new opportunities and industries and demand for work as fast as we might be eliminating it in other places. What has gone wrong in our trading relationship is we buy $500 billion of stuff from China, and China buys $100 billion of stuff from us. So we get all the disruption, but we don't get the commensurate boost in new economic opportunities for producers on the back end. And that's a real problem. The fascinating thing about trade deficits that economists will always emphasize is that a trade deficit always has to be exactly offset by a current account surplus. Sorry, a capital account surplus. The trade deficit is the current account deficit. It's not that we can actually just send China $100 billion of stuff and they'll send us $500 billion of stuff. We have to send them something back. We're not sending back goods and services, though. We're sending back assets. So the nature of the trading relationship is China sends us stuff, and we send back equities, corporate debt, treasury debt, real estate. And from the consumer welfare lens, and the standard economic view has been, this is great. If they'll send us all this stuff and we don't even have to make anything to send them in return, like that's even better than balanced trade. If you take the labor market view seriously, it's not good. And so your question goes to one of the points I emphasized, and is kind of a very discrete example, is if we're buying $400 billion of cheap electronics from China with treasury bonds, the transaction is we are literally buying on credit. They send us stuff, we send them pieces of paper that say we will send you a little bit every year and all of it at the end, except not really, we'll just send you even more treasury bonds then, right? That is, the relationship between that and our federal deficit is very interesting. If we're going to have a massive federal deficit, we're going to need somebody to take all the paper. But actually, increasingly, what we're sending back is not our federal paper, which we tend actually to hold domestically. It's corporate assets. And that, in a sense, is the worst of all. I mean, that is sort of the sort of selling off parts of your body to fund your gambling addiction, to be a little bit blunt about it. But it's seriously like, hey, we want $50 billion of cars. Like, this could be Japan. We want $50 billion of cars from Japan, but instead of sending them back $50 billion of airplanes from Boeing, we're going to send them $50 billion of Boeing stock. And oops, it's been 2 years and now Japan owns Boeing. So what are we going to send them in year 3? It's incredibly toxic, even if it looks great in the GDP numbers in 1 year, even if it looks great for everybody's consumption. It's incredibly toxic to the long-term trajectory of the economy and opportunities of workers. And that's something, again, that the market just doesn't solve for by itself. If you are indifferent, if all you care about is how much cheap stuff you get, then this is an efficient outcome. I think with a longer-term view, you realize it's actually not a very efficient outcome at all.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Cass. My name's Mark Nielsen from Georgetown. Thank you for coming here. I follow you on Twitter, and
Oh, no.
I'm also a denizen of Twitter, but a while back you were responding to a New York Times article in which it was comparing some of the outcomes of the effects on the family that certain Soviet policies had in comparison now to a lot of the effects of the market on the family. And while I was reading that Twitter thread, I was also reading Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, and it really kind of shook my worldview. With
his wonderful book or my tweet?
Both. But I would ask in that idea that we look at many of the assumptions we've had about classical liberalism, that they produce these certain outcomes, that they're always better, that we're always progressing. Do you find with what you've told us today that you doubt liberalism as maybe a philosophy like Mr. Deneen does? Do you think that liberalism has failed? And if so, what do you think is coming next?
That was a heavy question.
Sorry.
No, it's an excellent question, and thank you for being a Twitter follower. If you could all follow me on Twitter, one of my nemeses has 200 more followers than I do. So like together we can do this, and I can pass him today. And now you're all going to go, well, you won't because you don't care. But if you really cared, you'd go figure out who the nemesis is. So it's a fantastic question. I guess I would say I agree with a lot of the criticisms that Deneen and others have raised about things that we have just essentially stipulated liberalism always delivers, that it is not, in fact, delivering. I think the problem that the critique runs up against is that there isn't really an alternative offered. And that much as sort of democracy is the worst possible system except all the others, I think liberalism, broadly speaking, I mean, you can like define like liberalism is just, people cooperate. Is the Bernie Sanders line, government is just things we do together. Like at some point the definitions start to break down, but broadly speaking, the liberal worldview certainly seems to remain better than other alternatives anybody's come up with. I think the important thing to do is to recognize its limitations and to recognize, therefore, that as we are making policy, as we're making decisions in our own lives, as we're thinking about our culture, that we can't just take for granted that the market is automatically going to deliver everything that we want at the end of the day, that we have to take a more critical view of it. And so family is a perfect example. And what this Twitter thread was about was this fascinating story from the New York Times sometime in the 1970s, sort of like trying not to be too explicit that they really liked the Soviet Union better than the United States and lauding their system of universal childcare in the Soviet Union. And you actually read it, and first of all, it sounds awful. I mean, you've got like these terrible centers and these Soviet apparatchiks, if that's how you pronounce it, apparatchiks, kind of saying like, this is really good because we're getting kids away from their parents who don't really know how to raise good Soviet citizens. And then you've got like this small class of middle class intellectuals who aren't sure this is really the best way to raise kids, but like, what do they know? And anyway, it doesn't matter because the working class has no other choice because obviously everybody has to work. And then there's this weird like aside like, and when people in the Soviet Union learn that a single father in America can support a family of three or four, like their minds are just blown. And you just fast forward to today and you're like, wow, we're now debating, not imposing, but providing a similar option set because we now take for granted that we also must have two parents working. And you go back and you say like, gosh, like imagine, telling someone from the 1970s, like, we're doing these things now because we've decided we have no choice. And they would have assumed we'd lost the Cold War. And you would have said like, no, not only did we win the Cold War, but we tripled GDP and every measure we have says prosperity is higher than ever. And they just would have thought you were crazy. Look, getting people out of the house and into the workforce is good for GDP. I was at a conference yesterday where we were specifically talking about how one of the most important reasons to be offering universal child care is that it frees women up to work. And you can go find left of center think tanks that will emphasize how much additional GDP and tax revenue that will generate. And certainly women should have that option if that's what they want to do. But if our society if our economy is generating outcomes where that's the only choice, then per se we are not more prosperous than we were. And we have to find a way to measure and account for that as well.
Hello, Mr. Cass. My name is Rachel, representative from the Wharton Business Camp. I've seen your interviews and I've read some of your articles, and I think one thing that I always wonder about at these events is that we are not a room of philosophers, we are a room of doers. We are going on to be business leaders and respond to business imperatives. And one of my main questions that comes up when I read your articles is, what exactly do you want us to do? Should we hire or fire low-skilled immigrant labor? Should we raise the minimum wage at our companies flatly across the nation? We make these decisions every day, and I guess I'm not sure, following Adam Smith Society events, what I can do as a business leader day to day.
It's a very fair question. To some extent, these are huge collective action problems that do require policy responses. And so I'm always wary of saying, you go do something that is irrational given your personal incentive set and so forth, because it would be nice if everyone did it. There is a model of activism that sounds that way. I don't think it's especially reasonable or productive. But I do think there are some very concrete things. So one is you can stop putting the requirement of a college degree in job descriptions. Like, that's a really easy, discrete one. There's no reason any job description should ever say requires a college degree. If it requires a credential for licensing purposes, you can require that someone have a JD if they're going to be, if you're a law firm, but don't say the job requires a college degree. It's interesting if they have one, you can ask them about it, you can value it, but don't make that a threshold. And across the board, HR departments have just done this because they're lazy and it's easy. And I don't think there's much of a case that it's even a good business practice to begin with. Zooming out one step from that, I think we can redefine pretty significantly what corporate social responsibility means. Corporate social responsibility doesn't mean buying carbon offsets. not solving climate change that way, not actually doing much of anything that way, just like creating opportunity to prevent more glossy brochures that are actually worse for the environment than what you've accomplished with the carbon offsets. So if corporations actually took seriously that the biggest problem we have is that we have built an economic model that simply does not invest in less skilled workers, does not invest in struggling areas of the country, does not invest in business models that are going to use those workers, then we could say at the margin when we're making decisions, like that's actually something we value and something that we want to accomplish and deliver on. Nothing drives me more nuts than when people complain about a skills gap. I don't deny that a skills gap exists, that the jobs that firms would like to fill differ from the workers who are available in the marketplace. But by that definition, I have an infinity person skills gap because I would gladly hire infinity MIT PhDs tomorrow at $9 an hour to do biotech research for me, right? And like, I could go start an industry group and put out like a report saying that like Congress should provide me with $9 an hour MIT PhDs, but it's not a market failure. It's a market signal that I have a really dumb business idea. And businesses writ large, it's like, oh gosh, like, it turns out that when we try to, rapidly automate our processes with all this great new technology that we knew all the people we had on our workforce couldn't do, but so that was okay because we were going to lay them off, and this giant pool of highly skilled, productive workers who had been sitting on the sidelines were going to come in and do it instead. Like, that was really dumb. And historically, the way that American capitalism has worked and prosperity has grown has been not businesses just stipulating that they are entitled to labor at whatever cost they want to do whatever they want them to, but actually finding ways to pair the people who existed in the country with productive pursuits that serve people. And there are massive areas of the country today with underemployed, undertrained workers who absolutely want to work. I will stipulate they don't have the skills that IBM wants, but who absolutely want to work. And in Adam Smith terms, they are just $20 bills lying around on the ground. But we don't invest in those business models. Our business schools don't send people off to do them because we're going to change the world with our laundromat app instead. And then people don't want to move to those places. Like, if you were really an entrepreneur and a talented business person, and you have a choice between like, well, I could move to San Francisco and earn $200K a year working for something that has a 1 in 1,000 chance of being the next unicorn, or I could move to, pick your generic town in middle America and start a business in the massive white space of our underdeveloped industrial economy and build something with $5 or $10 million of cash flow over the next 10 years and like have it, a perfectly comfortable standard of living and like in all sorts of ways your life might be better. Like, wow, if you were a serious business person, that should sound really great. And yet somehow it doesn't compared to the, well, my unicorn probably will fail, but I'll still like hang out in fun, San Francisco coffee shops and earn plenty of money anyway. So that's the other place at which I would say like, look, actually personal decisions do count. And even for the rational individual, if you really scrutinize it, there are an awful lot of ways to build great lives and make a much bigger social impact in this world through moral business that are not what we are sending people into today. There you go. Thank you very much.